From January to November 1991, hundreds of fires plunged the Persian Gulf into darkness. The losing army, chased away from the lands they had conquered and plundered, left a trail of ruins, of fire, of poisonous, thick black liquid oozing onto the desert and into the sea. The small country of Kuwait first became a battlefield, and then it became an alien landscape covered in soot and lakes of crude oil. What made the scene truly apocalyptic were the plumes and clouds of black smoke rising from the burning oil wells and almost entirely blocking out the sun from view. As a Gulf War veteran later recalled, the sky was so dark it was like night. People's eyes were running with black tears. Time magazine would describe this event as the third worst environmental catastrophe in history, topped only by Chernobyl and Bhopal. Today, we will literally walk into the shadows of the Kuwait oil fires disaster when Saddam Hussein darkened the skies. The burning of the Kuwaiti oil wells took place in the context of the First Gulf War. This conflict kicked off on August 2, 1990, when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein launched the invasion of Kuwait, quickly occupying the small Gulf country. Iraqi military leadership expected from the start a strong international response. They were right. A US-led coalition force comprising 42 countries started assembling in Saudi Arabia as part of Operation Shield. On January 17, 1991, the coalition went on the attack, unleashing Operation Desert Storm. The Iraqi military proved no match against the combined might of the US and, well, basically 1/4 of the world's nations. But it soon became apparent that they had taken serious steps to prepare for one particular mission: laying waste to Kuwait's economy. From the start of the invasion, Iraqi military leadership expected to be driven out of Kuwait sooner or later. When that was to happen, they would devastate Kuwait's infrastructure and destroy its oil-producing capacity. This included targeting pumping stations, pipelines, refineries, and especially oil wells. According to a Department of Defense report titled Environmental Exposure Report, Oil Well Fires, authored by Bernard Rosker, the invaders had almost immediately rigged with plastic explosives two major oil fields, Minagish and Bergen. But the Iraqi army started practicing how to destroy and burn oil fields only in December 1990, when selected units performed test runs on 6 mock-up wells. And then the actual inferno first erupted on January 16, 1991, when the Wafra oil field went up in flames. The overall operation was directed by 30 to 40 military engineers, supported by some 1,000 detonation and demolition experts armed with charges of C4 explosives. Thanks to their practice with their mock-up wells, these demolition crews had honed the perfect technique. They packed each wellhead with up to 18 kilograms of C4 and then connected several primer cords to the same detonator, which allowed it to blow up several wells within the same field at the same time. From Wafra, Saddam's hell crews moved northwards, attempting their acts of sabotage on an estimated 732 oil wells. Of those, only 42 remained intact. Engineers and demolition experts also failed to completely blow up a further 50 wells. These wells did not ignite, but were severely damaged nonetheless, resulting in large oil spills into the desert. Millions of barrels a day were released, covering the landscape of Kuwait with more than 100 lakes of crude oil, some almost 2 meters deep, and covering a surface totaling 19 square kilometers. In addition to this uncontrolled release onto the ground, the Iraqi infantry purposefully collected some of the crude oil into large trenches placed along Kuwait's southern border. These trenches, 1 kilometer long, 3 meters wide, 3 meters deep, were then set fire to slow down the coalition advance. The tactical impact of the fire trenches would be minimal, but extinguishing them would prove a tough challenge after the war. Finally, 640 of the targeted wells erupted into fierce flames which would burn for 10 months, spewing columns of thick black smoke and plunging Kuwait into an almost permanent half-light. The plumes first became visible via satellite imagery on February the 8th. As time wore on, the number and size of these black clouds increased, peaking on the 24th of February. By then, smoke plumes from the northern oil fields joined with those spewing out of the southern wells, creating a composite superplume, 60 kilometers wide. The pitch-black clouds then rose as high as 3.7 kilometers, where they mixed with air and were eventually dispersed by seasonal strong winds from the northwest, typical of the region. Now, as we shall learn later, the high altitude of the plumes and the timely intervention of the winds greatly contributed to limiting the hazardous effects of the black smoke. In addition to targeting oil fields, Saddam's troops were determined to devastate Kuwait's entire oil industry and related facilities. For example, on January the 19th, the Iraqis damaged the Sea Island pipeline terminal, pumping millions of barrels of crude oil into the Persian Gulf. The already battered Kuwaiti infrastructure took more hits from their allies, the coalition's air forces. Between late January and early February, coalition strikes against Iraqi positions in Kuwait caused significant collateral damage, namely the destruction of 34 oil wells and 13 gathering stations or production hubs containing pipelines and storage tanks. All in all, Iraq's sabotage and destruction efforts may have resulted in the loss of more than 1 billion barrels, which was about 2% of Kuwait's crude oil reserves. Shortly after the first wells had erupted into fire, the US Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, intercepted an exchange of messages between the Iraqi units in the area. These communications referenced the 29th Infantry Division Chemical Warfare Headquarters and advised military engineers that, quote, protection masks should be worn at any explosion as poisons or poisonous gases are found at the wells. As these statements were shared with the press, speculation arose that the Iraqi army intended to use the burning wells to disperse chemical agents. This theory was not completely unrealistic, as Saddam had been known for having used chemical weapons against his enemies in the past, but something did not entirely check out. The DIA knew that oil fires raged at temperatures of between 600 and 800 degrees Celsius, whereas chemical munitions would be completely incinerated at a temperature of just 550. In fact, the DIA ordered a new translation of the original military dispatches, which returned a more harmless meaning. Quote, use masks while exploding wells because of poison gases in wells. Use them also during training. And note the subtle difference. Poison gases in wells versus poison gases at the wells. The second translation suggested that Iraqi troops were simply advised to use protective masks because of noxious gases, such as hydrogen sulfide, normally found in crude oil. And the risk of hydrogen sulfide inhalation was the reason for involving Saddam's feared chemical corps, a unit trained to handle this type of hazard. So, the wildly burning wells were not meant to douse the region in chemical death. Even so, the Butcher of Baghdad had 3 dastardly reasons to darken the skies. As his forces were forced to withdraw into Iraq, Saddam imposed a scorched earth policy on Kuwait's infrastructure to ensure coalition forces would find nothing of value on their advance. The dictator and his generals also hoped that the burning oil fields would yield a strategic advantage for their battered army. The military brass expected that the thick smoke plumes would impede coalition airstrikes as well as troop movements on the ground. As it turns out, the petroleum inferno only offered limited tactical advantages. Finally, Saddam had intended to punish and destroy Kuwait's oil industry since January 1990. Back then, Kuwait was an outlier within the 13-member Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Benefiting from returns of investments not related to fossil fuels, Kuwait had decided to lower the price of their crude oil. This decision had undermined the exports of Iraq's oil, relatively more expensive. Thus, Saddam and his government had a clear motive to sabotage Kuwait's oil production. If they could not maintain control of the country, they would at least attempt to destroy its current and future wealth. The devastation wrought by Saddam and his men had a severe impact on the entire country of Kuwait, but those most immediately affected were the employees of Kuwait Oil Company, or KOC, who watched in horror as most of their wells were being destroyed. Their initial despair, however, soon morphed into a desire for action. KOC personnel across the Middle East, Europe, and America put together a contingency plan to curb the environmental disaster and restore the country's production capabilities. This was Project Al-Auda, or The Return. The KOC team would act in conjunction with the governments of the coalition countries in order to secure the necessary supplies, equipment, and personnel. These joint efforts would be consolidated by Paul Tyson, economic officer at the US Embassy in London. The first order of business was to put out the oil fires, of course, but that required moving into Kuwait thousands of specialized contractors and their equipment, a task made even more daunting by the state of the local transport infrastructure, racked by the invasion first and then the coalition air campaign later. For example, Kuwait had 2 ports, but most of their piers had been damaged by bombing or blocked by sunken ships. Local and coalition authorities were able to charter a Moor 1 vessel at the port of Shuaik, which would be used to house and feed the first arriving crews of firefighters. But most of the equipment had to be transported via large cargo ships, which could not dock at the war-torn harbour. The solution was to direct the cargoes to the port of Jebel Ali in Dubai. There, the kit would be unloaded onto smaller vessels or even barges and then ferried across to Shuaik. As per the firefighters themselves, they landed directly at the Kuwait City airport, flying in from more than 20 countries. The first contractors arrived via military aircraft on March 15, 1991. Given the complexity and scale of the challenge, KOC and their coalition allies had to appoint a wide variety of partners. OG Drilling Inc. and the Santa Fe Drilling Company were entrusted to assemble a team of specialized firefighting companies. The first to answer the call became known as the Big Four: US firms Red Adair, Boots & Coots, and Wild Well Control, plus Canadian company Safety Boss. A fifth contractor, Bechtel Inc., was added to the roster to provide logistical support, supply material, and later assist in the reconstruction of KOC's infrastructure. In August 1991, more firefighting teams flocked to Kuwait, eager to contribute to the effort, hailing from 35 countries including France, Hungary, the UK, China, Iran, and the USSR. And on September 9th, the KOC formed their own team of flamebusters, the Kuwait Wild Well Killers. According to the KOC's official website, quote, "The team from Kuwait astonished foreign firefighting teams and observers when they extinguished the first burning well in a record of 12 minutes. The disparate assembly of firefighters established a friendly competition of sorts, displaying leaderboards with their results in Kuwait City's hotels. The Kuwait Wild Well Killers, despite arriving late to the game, were able to extinguish 41 wells in total. But the undisputed top scorers were the fearless Canadian boys at Safety Boss, who put out 126 fires over just 5 months. KOC and the coalition had initially estimated that it would take 2 to 5 years to extinguish or cap all 640 burning wells, but the last fire was snuffed out on November 6, 1991. It had taken a little more than 7 months to cancel the apocalypse brought about by Saddam's saboteurs, an almost impossible endeavor. But how had it been achieved? Well, first of all, the international response team performed a logistics miracle, assembling a team that comprised approximately 11,450 firefighters, drilling operators, petroleum engineers, support personnel, and safety engineers. They could access an arsenal of 5,000 pieces of heavy equipment, as well as 450 kilometers of piping, sourcing water both from the sea and 361 lagoons, each filled with 1 million gallons. Moreover, the Big Four and the other intervening teams conducted grueling 14-hour shifts each and every day to combat their fiery foe. But even numbers, resources, and hours of hard work may lead to failure unless you employ the right methods. And this battle would require a combination of true and tested tactics, as well as innovative solutions. Coordinator Paul Tyson was open to every suggestion, even if some of the proposals were not exactly realistic. Quoting from him here, "For some reason or another, my phone and my fax became the contact point, and we were dealing with what we called the purple death ray people." And that would be, someone calls up and says, "I have a purple death ray that can solve the firefighting. If you give me $1 million or whatever, this will go on." Luckily, the fire teams did not have to rely on purple rays, but on more scientific approaches. Firstly, they used satellite data from NASA's Landsat program to pinpoint, with accuracy, the location of burning oil fields. Then, the fields had to be cleared of hazards. Retreating Iraqi land forces had laid down minefields, barbed wire, and booby traps, which had to be identified and removed, or at least clearly signaled. Crews also had to drain nearby lakes of spilling crude oil to prevent entire fields from bursting into fireballs. Once this nerve-wracking phase was concluded, it was time to starve out the burning wells. The fires raging atop the structures were fed by thousands of gallons of crude oil and natural gas pumped at a high rate from the bowels of the earth. A popular method was for fire crews to drill relief ducts, which intersected the main wells and redirected the flow of oil and gas. If drilling was impractical, the same effect could be achieved by surgically placing charges of dynamite. Even once a well had been starved, its head would continue burning. The teams tackled this last challenge in the most obvious way, by spraying them with cool water. As mentioned, this was sourced from 361 lagoons, but most of all from the sea. Thanks to a converted oil pipeline, the Big Four and their international colleagues were able to pump water from the Persian Gulf at a rate of more than 1 million liters per hour. This simple technique allowed teams to subdue 90% of the burning wells at a rate which topped out at 13 wells per day. But sometimes, just spraying water was not enough, and the indomitable crews had to resort to wildly innovative techniques. One of these was known as raising the plume. This method involved applying a metal casing some 10 meters high over the well's head, then liquid nitrogen or water were pumped into the casing, which snuffed out the flame's oxygen supply. When even that failed, crews resorted to charges of explosives placed inside large metal drums with fire-retardant chemicals and then wrapped in insulating materials. The drums would then be lifted next to the flame with a crane and detonated. Thus, the controlled explosion would blast away any remaining fuel, as well as the surrounding oxygen feeding the flames. On other occasions, crews utilized modified heavy machinery with spectacular results. One of the big four, Red Adair, employed a bulldozer covered with a heat shield and fitted with a mechanical arm. After spraying both the dozer and the well with plenty of water, the operator used the arm to clasp and then plug the oil pipe, thus cutting off the flame supply. The prize for most unconventional method, however, should go to the contraption devised by a Hungarian team, which the Canadian crews nicknamed the Master Blaster. The Hungarians had somehow procured an old Soviet T-55 tank and fitted it with 2 turbine engines from a MiG-21 jet, which sprayed high-pressure water at an incredible rate. As described by Canadian firefighter Frank Tooby, Master Blaster is great for television because it shrieks like a banshee and throws prodigious quantities of water at a fire in just a few seconds. When it's applied against the simple candle-type well-fire plume, the results are impressive. The tireless actions of the crews, as well as of the apocalyptic landscape caused by the fires, were captured in film by legendary German director Werner Herzog in his documentary Lessons of Darkness. In a scene which left many viewers puzzled, 2 firefighters, torch in hand, approach a column of crude oil, violently jutting out of the earth and into the sky. Herzog's off-screen voice comments, "What are they up to? Are they going to rekindle the blaze?" And in fact, counterintuitively, they do. Herzog muses, "Has life without fire become unbearable for them?" The mysterious scene, captured by the German filmmaker, actually depicted a common safety procedure to handle non-ignited blowouts or violent ejections of oil and natural gas. These blowouts were at high risk of exploding into a giant fireball at a later stage. Therefore, in a bid to control them, safety crews actually preferred igniting them at the source and then dealing with the fire by using one of the methods we previously described. In addition to snuffing out hell above the desert, the cleanup crews drained the oil lake soaking the sands, removing an estimated 21 million barrels from the soil. Next, Bechtel and the KOC embarked into Project Altamir, or reconstruction, to rebuild the country's oil extraction and exporting facilities. They rebuilt offshore piers, tank farms, gathering centers, as well as more than 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles of pipelines, restoring production to pre-war capacity in barely 12 months. Operation Desert Storm had been concluded already on February 28, 1991, with the utter defeat of the Iraqi armed forces. And what appeared to be one of their best prepared operations, the scorching of the earth in Kuwait, had at least partially failed thanks to the indefatigable efforts of the firefighting and reconstruction crews. And we should underscore partially, as Saddam's plans did cause some serious losses to Kuwait's economy. As mentioned earlier, more than 1 billion barrels of crude oil had been lost. Moreover, the well capping and reconstruction projects had cost $5 billion, which is $11.6 billion in 2024 money. Considering also the lost economic output caused by the Iraqi occupation, the Kuwaiti economy had lost up to $50 billion, or $116 billion, adjusted for inflation. There was another cost, much more difficult to quantify though, and that was the environmental impact. The fire crews had completed their job at record speed, but the well fires had been burning for months, discharging immense volumes of toxic particles into the air. Damaged pipelines and other facilities had poured more than 20 million barrels into the desert, plus an additional 11 million into the waters of the Persian Gulf. By comparison, the catastrophic Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 had released 5 million barrels in the Gulf of Mexico. The wildlife and livestock in the region paid the immediate price, according to NASA observers, quote, "The sand and gravel on the land surface combined with oil and soot to form a layer of hardened tarcrete over almost 5% of the country's area. Scores of livestock and other animals died from the oily mist, their lungs blackened by the liquid." The contaminants released into the atmosphere were far more difficult to observe and therefore to control. According to the already mentioned Department of Defense report by Bernard Rosker, the burning crude oil smoke was a mixture of heated, potentially noxious gases and coated carbon particles representing combustion products. These combustion products included well-known polluting and toxic molecules such as carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, heavy metals, and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These are defined as gaseous emissions from solids or liquids which may have adverse health effects. The greatest hazard was posed by the high concentration of PM10s, or particles smaller than 10 micrometers in aerodynamic diameter. These tiny particles can potentially nestle deep in the lungs of animals and humans, increasing the risk of serious respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Based on the Rostka report, the Kuwait oil fires may have emitted 3,400 tons of PM10s per day. The environmental disaster was best summarized by the US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, John Hubert Kelly. Saddam has managed to change the environment. Not only did he cover Kuwait and much of the Arab states with that black soot, but he also opened the oil pipeline sluices which flooded the Gulf itself, with oil slicks severely damaging all animal life in its path and endangering Saudi's water intake plants further south. He created an environmental catastrophe in the Gulf area. Our pilot flew at low level over much of Kuwait so that we could get a good close look. It was a scene out of Dante's Inferno. We had some feeling for what we might see because the rain in Riyadh was already black. In Damascus, 800 miles away, the rain was as black as it was in Tehran. The atmosphere had been thoroughly polluted. So we had some inkling of what we might see, but it was far worse than I expected. Sadly, this environmental catastrophe was not addressed immediately. As pointed out by Mashari Al-Matari, environmental consultant with the KOC, had the Kuwaiti government tackled the issue within 1994, cleanup operations would have been relatively quick and easy. The government even received compensation funds from Iraq and the UN in order to address environmental damage, but the vast majority, some $2 billion, were used up in reconstruction and revegetation of just a relatively small area. For more than 2 decades, the remediation of Kuwait's damaged soil and coastlines was delayed and postponed by other priorities, bureaucratic challenges, and a complex tendering cycle. Finally, in 2020, the KOC themselves awarded 2 tenders to specialized contractors, which have since cleaned up some 2.3 million cubic meters of polluted sands. But that's just 10% of the overall contaminated soil, which is still responsible for widespread plant and animal mortality. The pollutant agents have also infiltrated the groundwater aquifers in northern Kuwait, a lingering disaster for both agriculture and local industries. Back in the early 1990s, US government agencies took immediate steps to evaluate the impact of such toxic devastation on the health of military personnel and civilians in the area. It became a well-established medical fact that 1/3 of Gulf War veterans suffered from a mysterious chronic multi-symptom illness, or CMI, better known as Gulf War syndrome. The symptoms experienced included fatigue, headache, chronic pain, skin rashes, diarrhea, insomnia, memory loss, and other cognitive problems. Exposure to oil fires is sometimes cited as one of the many possible causes for this CMI, but a clear causal relationship has never been established. The Government Accountability Office, or GAO, first evaluated whether the Department of Defense had taken the necessary measures to protect US troops against the infernal clouds of poisonous smoke. It appears that the Pentagon was aware of the hazard since September 1990, but issued health guidance only in February 1991. Even so, 270 veterans surveyed by the GAO reported that they had been issued protective gear to face potential biochemical attacks. But this gear was not suited to filtering out VOCs, PM10s, or any other oil-related contaminants. Moreover, the troops had not been informed about the danger of exposure to the burning wells. Lacking guidance, troops on the ground improvised using bandanas or handkerchiefs to protect their airways, which proved mildly effective in filtering out smoke and soot. Luckily, most soldiers surveyed by the GAO and other agencies were subjected only in the short term to the fallout of the fire, which included the byproduct of combustion as well as unburned oil raining from above. This exposure produced some clear symptoms such as coughing, shortness of breath, rashes, fatigue, and throat irritation. A study conducted by the University of Iowa found that, quoting here, Gulf War veterans self-reported a statistically significant 3.1% increase in the rate of asthma and bronchitis over non-Gulf War veterans. All of these medical findings were confirmed by yet another study conducted on 1,599 soldiers and published in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine in June 1999. Once again, these troops experienced eye and upper respiratory tract irritation, shortness of breath, cough, rashes, and fatigue. Symptoms were associated with reported proximity to oil fires. All in all, these were the symptoms that you would expect from operating near raging fires, and in general, they appeared manageable without long-term consequences. But what of the effects caused by the contaminants that we mentioned earlier? Shortly after the end of the conflict, the World Meteorological Organization collected air samples to assess exactly that risk. And the results were surprising. Quoting again from the Rostka report, these studies' data included that except for particulate matter, PM10s, pollutant levels were surprisingly low. All groups found that levels of pollutant gases were lower than anticipated and did not exceed those found in the air over a typical US industrial city. In other words, Great news! The black smoke had risen at high altitudes and was later dispersed by the winds, thus limiting the concentration of pollutants in the same geographical area. Moreover, both troops and civilian personnel had limited their exposure to only short periods of time. But what about PM10s, or particulate matter? That could still cause issues in the long term. That hazard, including the risk of developing cancer, was explored by the US Army Environmental Hygiene Agency from 1991 to 1994. I'm happy to report that based on their findings, quote, the potential for significant long-term adverse health effects from oil fire exposure was minimal. The excess cancer risk resulting from exposure to oil fire smoke, both in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, fell within 2 excess cancers per million population exposed. As per the fire crews of the Big Four and their international allies, they also fared well. Firefighters did experience some accidents, but none of them caused permanent injury. As per their overall health, the University of Texas conducted multiple studies on a sample of 110 crewmen with encouraging results. Surprisingly, none of them experienced symptoms similar to those besetting affected troops and did not report any significant illness in the months after their ordeal. As of 2024, the US Department of Veteran Affairs reassures that, quote, research does not show evidence of long-term health problems from exposure to oil well fires at this time. These studies and findings, however, may be limited by their methodology, especially when it comes to assessing the impact of the fires over the ensuing decades. Anecdotal accounts suggest that several individuals may have contracted serious illnesses, as reported by The Guardian in 2021. Sarah Akbar, for example, a chemical engineer and the only female firefighter in 1991, stated, quote, the doctor said it was as if I was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes every day for 3 years. Those were the kind of lungs I had. While US veteran Jeffrey Hall, who was exposed to the oil fires for a week in 2017, was diagnosed with pulmonary sarcoidosis, a rare chronic disease which has destroyed his immune system. Now, we may never be able to accurately ascertain if the raging oil fires did cause victims to get these diseases, but we can certainly link a confirmed number of fatalities to Saddam's infernal plan. On March 21, 1991, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport plane operated by the Royal Saudi Air Force was about to land at Ras al-Mashab in northeastern Saudi Arabia. The C-130 had departed from Jeddah on the Red Sea, and it transported 6 crew members and 95 Senegalese soldiers, part of the coalition forces. By then, Operation Desert Storm had concluded. In fact, the Senegalese soldiers were not returning from a military operation, but rather from a pilgrimage as they had visited the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad at Medina. But as the C-130 approached Ras al-Mashab, it was engulfed by one of the thick black plumes of oil smoke blown southwards from the Wafra field. Due to poor visibility, the pilot descended too low and too early, and the plane suffered a devastating crash. All 6 members, as well as 92 Senegalese soldiers, lost their lives. There were only 3 survivors. And 10 months of gushing and burning oil fields certainly dealt a heavy blow to the welfare and the environment of an entire country. Plus, an unspecified number of individuals have certainly suffered serious health consequences. Overall, however, the devastation caused by Saddam Hussein's sabotage squads could have exacted a much, much heavier toll. The fact that today we are not counting casualties in the hundreds or thousands is a testament to the skill, hard work, and personal sacrifice of those thousands of firefighters, engineers, and other experts who bravely stepped into the shadows and put out the flames of hell on earth.